Hi guys, this is Mr. Y. Today we're going to be talking about cycles. Now in one of the other presentations when we talked about the levels of life, we talked about how the Earth is a closed system in terms of mass or matter. And now we're going to delve into how that matter circulates throughout the surface of the Earth so that we, biological creatures, can all use it. So specifically we're going to be talking about different types of biological cycles. These are repeating events that are needed for life to survive. This would include the water cycle, carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. There are other cycles too, the phosphorus cycle, the rock cycle, that we're not going to cover that in depth, but you should still know a few key points of those. So, learning objectives for today, again, to learn about the water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles, to recognize what drives the water cycle and where fresh water, the water we have to drink in general, comes from. Recognize what drives the carbon cycle and how it can be affected by human activities, and to recognize the quote-unquote weak points of the carbon and nitrogen cycles. So here's a picture of the water cycle. There's another picture, I believe, on page 75 of your textbook, and of course you can see that the water cycle occurs not just on land but on over the oceans as well. So I'm just going to start here on the left. Because this is a cycle, there's really no start or beginning over to this entire process, so I'll just start from my left and work over. We have evaporation from the ocean going up into the clouds, which of course can then rain back on the ocean, and that can go back and forth between itself. A lot of times clouds will move over land, and then of course rain can fall down there. You can of course have evaporation from water sources on land, rivers, lakes, ponds, any of that stuff. And you can also get evaporation through this process we call transpiration, which we'll talk about on one of the future slides. Now, a lot of the rainwater over land can actually run down the land and actually back into water sources and eventually make its way back to the ocean through what we call runoff. But a lot of it actually gets into the soil and can actually slowly build up in the soil and then can actually make its way back into the ocean systems as well. And this whole process is being driven by the one point I haven't mentioned on this picture right here, the sun. So it's the sun that causes the evaporation, the heat from the sun, that is, to be specific. And because of that evaporation, this water cycle is continuously moving. Without the evaporation process, well, this step doesn't happen, and neither does this step over here. And once evaporation and transpiration wouldn't work either, once those three stop working, none of this whole cycle is going to work for very long. So it's really solar energy that drives the water cycle. So, as I said, the water cycle moves in a global system. It's what keeps a steady but small supply of fresh water available for not just human use but other animals to use as well. As I said before, it's powered by solar energy, and one of those types of evaporations that I gave a specific name through called transpiration, you can see in this picture here. I'll go into it in a little bit more in a second, but of course you can see evaporation happening in this picture right here. And we'll also talk about evaporation in terms of human physiology in a few more slides. Alright, transpiration. This is the loss of water by plant leaves as photosynthesis occurs. Now, believe it or not, this actually happens naturally, and plants do this so that they continually pull up more water through their bodies, if you want to call them that. And as the water out here on the leaves actually evaporates, it kind of creates a bit of a vacuum. And because water likes to stick to itself, it likes to it's very cohesive with itself. It likes to stick to itself. It keeps pulling more and more water up. So the plant's continuously given a supply of fresh water as the older water molecules evaporate. And this process happens a huge amount the more plants there are. You talk about things like tropical rainforests, and there's always mists and fogs in tropical rainforests. A lot of that water in the air comes from the plants. So another use for evaporation in terms of how water gets into the water cycle, that's not really big, but it's interesting to note, is through the use of sweating, which is what we see here on the picture on the right. Now, sweating actually doesn't cool you down. That's the interesting thing. You perspire this water out of your body, but the water is actually the same temperature as your body at about 95 to 96, 97 to 98 degrees. What's actually cooling you down is when the water evaporates off your skin, it absorbs the heat from around your skin. And when that heat is absorbed, your skin feels cooler because all the heat is being used to evaporate that sweat. So it's not really the water itself that cools you down. And a good way to think about this is if when you get out of a swimming pool on a really, really windy day, that wind will make you feel cold very, very quickly unless you put a towel on, because the wind is actually pushing air particles into the water, causing it to evaporate and making you much, much colder than you're expecting to be. So let's talk more about freshwater. Specifically, let's talk about rainwater. You can see here a picture of rain on the left-hand side, and you can see that general fog or mist that forms over high vegetation areas like tropical islands and tropical rainforests and things of that nature. So where does actually most of the rainwater originally come from? Well, the answer is actually relatively simple. It comes from the oceans. And you got to keep in mind that, again, this whole cycle helps create lots and lots of fresh water thanks to ocean water being filtered by this process of evaporation. So the water itself gets filtered out so that the salt and all the other particles that are in the oceanic water stay in the ocean, whereas only the water itself actually ends up in the clouds. That and a little bit of dirt, but usually it's just the water. And you can see this process in this picture here. You see the evaporation line here from the ocean, and then it traveling over land, and then precipitation back down, and then you can get transpiration going back to help form the clouds again, and then you have groundwater down here, and again you could argue there's runoff from streams, rivers, lakes, and all that stuff back to the ocean or to the seas. Now, if you actually look at the amount of fresh water on Earth, it's not all that much. This is actually a pretty old diagram. I'll show you a more up-to-date one in the next one, but this on the very top shows all the water on Earth, and you can see 97% of it is saline. That's ocean water, salt water. And we, of course, can't drink salt water. And only about 3% of that of the water on Earth, is actually what we classify as fresh water. That's water that's actually potentially drinkable. And if you actually look at that small piece there and you blow it up and you ask yourself, well, how much of this fresh water is what type of fresh water it is, you'll actually find that most of the fresh water exists in not liquid form at all. It's actually mostly trapped in the ice caps and the glaciers, whereas only a third of it is groundwater, that is water under the ground. As I said, this is actually a pretty old picture. My guess is that this has actually changed substantially as the ice caps and glaciers are melting. This percentage is going to go down, and this percentage is going to go up, of course. And it's not that there's any more fresh water, it's just that the freshwater resources we have are slowly changing. Because the ice caps and glaciers, keep in mind, when they melt, well, where do they go? They go back to the ocean water. So the groundwater percentage might be going up, but the actual total amount, this 3% here, is probably decreasing. And then there's this really small sliver here in the second pie graph that's called surface water. And this is what makes up all the lakes, all the rivers, all the swamps we know of. Keep in mind, this includes every lake you've ever heard of, all the Great Lakes, every lake in the world, whether it's in Africa, Asia, wherever, all the rivers, think of rivers like the Amazon, the Mississippi, all that water only makes up 0.3% of 3% of all the water on the Earth. So you can see there is a lot of water on Earth, and only a small portion of it is actually easily accessible to us humans. Even when the fresh water was in ice caps or glaciers, we didn't have very easy access to it, and groundwater you have to drill for. So most of the water that's easy access for people to get a hold of is in lakes, rivers, and things like that, and that's not all that much water by comparison to the total amount of water on Earth. This is a bit more up-to-date graph. It's showing the same basic idea that of the oceans, only a very small portion of the water that exists, on the world, not the oceans, but in the world is freshwater. And of that freshwater, most of that is actually locked up in glaciers. About a third of it is locked up in groundwater. Permafrost is frost that's constantly permanent in places like Siberia that never melts. And then of that groundwater, you can argue only a teeny tiny small percentage of that is actually what they call surface water, or water we have easy access to. And so all of these figures down here are only a small tiny portion of, they call it groundwater in this graph, which is still only a small tiny portion of all the water on Earth. So we're not dealing with a whole lot of real true fresh water on Earth. Most of it is actually unusable to us as oceanic water. So that's the basic systems of the water cycle. Again, there's a picture on page 75 in your book. Make sure you know the key points. Make sure you know the drivers of it. Now, let's go on to the carbon cycle. There's another picture on, I want to say, page 77 of your textbook that's similar to this. And let's run through the basic arrows again. Again, there's really no start to a cycle, but I'm just going to start on the left. Just that's where I want to start. So we have over here, down on the dead fishy here, we have decomposition. Decomposition releases gases. A lot of times these are carbon-based gases, carbon dioxide, methane gas, and these can come literally through the water and dissolve into the water and then make their way up to the atmosphere. And then this adds to the carbon dioxide supply, or the methane supply, in the atmosphere. And you can also get carbon dioxide, of course, from animals through cellular respiration, through breathing, and you can also actually get a little bit of carbon dioxide through plants as well, believe it or not, because plants do cellular respiration. And the reason I didn't start all the way on the left, because this is a unique one, this is the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels include things like coal, wood, oils, gasoline, and this is actually a man-made step. So let's just label that man-made step. So in true sense, this step shouldn't be part of the cycle, but it is in reality. And so it all adds up to build up the carbon dioxide supply in the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide supply in the atmosphere gets reduced through the process of photosynthesis. And again, we've talked about photosynthesis in the last unit, about how plants take carbon dioxide and sunlight and turn it into high energy sugar molecules. Keep in mind, you can also have carbon dioxide released on land through dead decaying matter as well. There could be a dead rabbit here, for all I know, and that would be releasing carbon dioxide as well, methane gases as well, and that would continue the carbon cycle. And keep in mind, a lot of carbon and methane gas exists in the oceans as well. Some of it's actually exists in ice water, and it's actually frozen. And when we melt the ice water, that carbon gets added to the total amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is why a lot of people like to argue about carbon dioxide buildup. It's because there's a lot of ways for carbon to get into the atmospheric form, and there's only one real major way for it to get out: photosynthesis. So the carbon cycle reflects what we call a reciprocal process. A reciprocal process is a process of pairs. So one pair working one way, one pair working the other way. And it's a reciprocal process between, in nature, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And we talked about this in the last unit. The autotrophs, the plants, the producers, they get the carbon they need to make their food from photosynthesis. And because of this, they can actually grow bigger in size thanks to the carbon dioxide in the air. And this is a big problem for people to understand sometimes, that the plants that do photosynthesis, the actual matter that makes them up actually comes from air, and that's a really hard idea. Most people will initially tend to think that, no, all the matter they must have comes from the soil, but that's never the case. It's the carbon dioxide in the air that makes things like trees so massive. It's not necessarily the nutrients in the soil. The nutrients and the water in the soil, they help, but most of the mass of a plant actually comes from carbon dioxide, and the carbon molecules being rearranged to form glucose molecules through photosynthesis. So heterotrophs, on the other end, the consumers, things like you and me that actually eat other organisms, get the carbon they need from their food. But we, of course, release carbon dioxide through cellular respiration so that our metabolism can work properly. Carbon dioxide in the carbon cycle is also known as a greenhouse gas, and a lot of people think that because it's a greenhouse gas, it's inherently bad. And that's not necessarily the case. Greenhouse gas is the name for any type of gas that has this tendency to trap heat from the sun. This should be from the sun. Sorry about that. And carbon dioxide does this well. Methane gas, CH4, does this really, really well. And even though I don't show methane gas and the carbon cycle, it is part of the carbon cycle in a way. It just doesn't have a clear path that it travels as carbon dioxide. That's why we stick to carbon dioxide. And we know that we can get more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, coal and wood, as counts as not a fossil fuel, but it's a fuel. So as we add more and more and more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, more heat would get trapped. And it's important to note that this is actually a natural process. The greenhouse effect is designed in a way to keep the Earth's temperature stable. It's kind of like our winter coat. A certain amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are necessary so that the Earth does not lose too much of the sun's heat and cool off too much at night. And if you ever actually study information on like other planets like Mars or the Moon or Jupiter or wherever, you'll see that they have these huge temperature swings because there's no atmosphere. And without the atmosphere, there's no gases to actually trap the heat of the sun. So there's these huge temperature swings from day to night of like 200 to 300 to 400 degrees. And keep in mind that while the greenhouse effect is a natural process designed to keep the Earth warm, when it becomes too much, when we add too much carbon dioxide, too much methane gas, and too much other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, that's where you get this effect called global warming or climate change. And this is, as I said before, to be the result of too much carbon emissions into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, methane gas. So it's kind of like going outside during a blizzard. If you want to keep warm, you put on a winter coat. But then for some strange reason, you put on a second winter coat, and a third winter coat, and a fourth winter coat. And at some point, you're actually going to start to overheat your body. That's kind of what global warming is. While you do need at least a little bit of protection from the outside, having too much is not a good thing. So here's a basic picture. I think there's a very similar picture in your book in around the same chapter on the greenhouse effect, but it just shows the basic process. Sunlight comes in through the Earth's atmosphere. Oftentimes it'll hit the surface of water more likely than land, get reflected back up, and then gets trapped by all the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and methane gas especially. Some of it does escape, but a good portion of it kind of gets stuck in the atmosphere and keeps the Earth's temperature relatively stable. Again, this is a natural process. We need this to happen to a certain extent. But as you add more and more and more carbon gases into the atmosphere, the amount of heat that escapes becomes less and less and less, and you start to warm up more than is good for the general environment. So that's the carbon cycle. Again, make sure you review the steps. I want to say the picture's on page 77. Ask questions if you have any. Last up, the nitrogen cycle. Now, the nitrogen cycle has a lot of little tricky steps, but it's really not that bad if you think about it in a general stance. So I'm going to, again, start through some of this stuff, and I'm not going to worry about a lot of the key details and little parts of it, but I want you to know the general ideas. So let's start at the top in this case. Now, if you know anything about the atmosphere, you know that most of the atmosphere is not oxygen. It's mostly nitrogen. In fact, this is about 80% of our Earth's atmosphere. It's close to 80%. I want to say it's like 78, something like that. And in this form, nitrogen takes the form of N2, just two nitrogen atoms stuck together. It's essentially useless. We breathe it in, but it's inert. It doesn't react with anything. Nothing can really use it in terms of animals or plants, except for one type of bacteria that lives in roots of legumes. Legumes are things like peanuts would be an example of a legume. And these bacteria that live in the roots of these things can actually use this atmospheric nitrogen, and the waste product they produce ends up being a type of ammonia, like NH3, which then can later be converted or degraded into NH4. And we call these types of bacteria nitrogen fixing bacteria. They are fixing the useless N2 nitrogen into a type of nitrogen compound that can be used by other creatures. And you can see there's lots of different nitrifying bacteria that will convert it from one type of ammonium to ammonia. And you can see this puts the ammonia into the soil for things like plants to use. They call this process assimilation. Plants will then take up the nitrogen through their roots. Again, this would be where their nutrients come in. And then something like an animal would get the nitrogen from its food. So any animal that then eats this animal, that eats this little guy, like a hawk or something, would then get the nitrogen it needs from this meat, which came from the plant, which came from the soil, which you could track back all the way to the specific bacteria living in the roots of legumes that actually use this useless nitrogen that nobody else can mess with. Keep in mind, back at this animal over here, he can actually release nitrogen into the soil two different ways. One, through the waste products he produces, urine and feces, or two, if he gets killed, when his body decomposes and breaks down, that nitrogen will then be released back into the soil as well. So animals release nitrogen either by their waste products or by death or decay, and so do plants. Death or decay as well releases their nitrogen content back into the soil, and that's where things like decomposers come in. They can actually take the nitrogen up there and also use that nitrogen, and so we have this kind of weird inner cycle going on here and here inside of the larger nitrogen cycle. And this is where most of the nitrogen we deal with comes from, this inner cycle. But there is actually a way out of this. There's another type of bacteria that will actually take a type of nitrogen and convert it back into nitrogen gas, the useless N2 version. So you have this large overall cycle from here back through those little two cycles and then back out here. And one of the more interesting features to note is that because this side over here and this side over here are highly dependent on specific types of bacteria, there's a lot of fuss over climate change, especially when it comes to this side, because should something happen to these bacteria in the roots of legumes, if something like climate change should happen and suddenly they can't exist anymore, if they go extinct, well then there's no way to get this useless nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere. There's no way for the nitrogen to get into the soil to begin with. And yes, these two small inner cycles would keep working for a while, but slowly more and more and more and more nitrogen would start to leak back out and become useless nitrogen gas from which there would be no escape. So that's one of the major issues with climate change, is making sure that the bacteria that keep this whole nitrogen cycle working don't go extinct. That's one of the big reasons scientists are very concerned with it. So this is another picture of the nitrogen cycle. Again, there's certain bacteria that will fix the nitrogen, and there are other bacteria that will actually make the nitrogen in the soil go back to atmospheric form, and then you can have these inner cycles working. There should be an arrow going this way from the plant to the animal. Inner cycles working inside of the larger nitrogen cycle between the plants, the animals, the decomposers, the funguses that will keep going. But again, if something should happen to the nitrogen fixating bacteria on this side, if something were to happen to them, if climate change was to suddenly cause them to go extinct, there would be massive problems after a while, because sooner or later the soil would run out of nutrients to support plant life. And if the plants go, well, then so does everything that depends upon the plants. This would be a version of the nitrogen cycle you would see in like maybe middle school. I like it just because it's a nice simplified version. But again, it shows you the bacteria that fix the nitrogen for use by plants. It doesn't show you that doesn't show you the nitrogen going back into the atmosphere, but it does show you the nitrogen going from the plants to the animals. So again, this is just a much more simplified version. So some key points to recap the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen fixation, there's only a few types of bacteria that live in the roots of plants called legumes that can make the useless nitrogen into useful types of ammonia in the soil. So this is an N2 gas right here. N2, it's got the label right there as well. And then this is the more useful kind that we would want to see in the soil that plants can use, and then therefore can be eaten by creatures that eat plants, and then creatures that eat the other creatures that eat plants, and that's how the nitrogen gets passed along up the food chain. So the consumers, that would be creatures like us, get the nitrogen they need from eating plants or animals that eat the plants after they absorb the nitrogen from the soil or the oceans. Where the consumers return the nitrogen is through their waste products, again, urine, feces, or when they die and their bodies decay and break down. Nitrogen in the soil can be returned to the atmosphere by another type of bacteria. This is called denitrification, so it does slowly leak back into that reservoir or that useless nitrogen N2 form in the atmospheric gas. And keep in mind, even something like waste product has quite a bit of nitrogen gas. This is actually the molecular compound of urea, urine. And you can see it has 2 nitrogen molecules right there. Highly toxic. That's why your body has to get rid of it. And keep in mind, farmers will often use nitrogen in their fertilizers. It generally increases the size and growth rate of plants. So you can see right here, this farmer spraying this fertilizer, and it says right there, anhydrous ammonium. Lots and lots and lots of nitrogen. Most types of things, the Miracle-Gro plant food, if you ever do any gardening, always will have lots and lots of high nitrites or nitrates. Lots of nitrogen. And one last time, again, same cycle, different picture. It's showing, you can see the 2 inner cycles here, and then the larger outer cycle from the atmospheric nitrogen down into the soil. So that's the general basics of the nitrogen cycle. You don't have to know all the little tiny steps going from nitrites to nitrates or from ammoniums to all that stuff. Just know the key weak points here, and how consumers and producers get their nitrogen. So that's going to wrap up the lecture on biological cycles, guys. Make sure you ask questions in class if you need any help, and I'll see you in the next video.